Well, again, Shabbat Shalom. I'm very excited to be able to be here, as always, to be able to share in the Shabbat service with you on a virtual congregational meeting room here on Pal Talk. It is really wonderful for brethren to come together in unity, and it is good and pleasant. And what a wonderful way for us to meet together in such scattered locations, but yet we are together to worship and to praise and to study and become more deeply in relationship with our Creator. So we come now together to look at the second part of the teaching that I started last week on the armor of Elohim from Ephesians chapter 6. And we're going to go ahead and finish that today. I was certainly torn in wanting to either finish this or delve into the just absolutely abundant amount of wonderful stuff that's in this week's Torah portion to cover. And then I realized that we're going to be touching on a good number of those verses in this teaching anyway, so that we might as well just go ahead and finish the Armor of Elohim part 2 here. And we will touch on quite a few of the verses in Deuteronomy that apply. And so we'll get our have our cake and eat it too here by being able to do a continuation of the teaching as well as touching on the Torah portion. So let me just quickly review for those of you who maybe did not get to hear part 1. In part 1, we covered from Ephesians chapter 6, if you can all turn there, beginning in verse 11. It says, "Put on the complete armor of Elohim, for you to have power to stand against the schemes of the devil." And that's what we all need. We all need power to stand. And so we are encouraged here by Rav Shaul to put on the complete armor. And now he's going to go into detail describing the different elements of the armor so that we are well armed. He says, "We do not wrestle against flesh and blood," verse 12, "but against principalities, against authorities, against the world rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual matters of wickedness in the heavenlies. Because of this, take up the complete armor of Elohim, so that you have power to withstand in the wicked day, and having done all, to stand." And I think we can all agree that we are definitely in a wicked day. And if we are going to stand, we're going to need to have on our armor in its complete and full, and it should be on completely and in full battle readiness. We should be inspecting it to see if there's any holes in the armor. We need to make sure that every piece of the armor is well fitted together and in good condition. So let's look at these pieces. Now, last week we covered the first element, which was girding your waist with truth. And I encourage you, if you did not get to hear that, to go back and listen to it. It's available on my website for free to listen to, and on the Podomatic page that we have as well. The second element was to then put on the breastplate of righteousness. And so we were talking about truth and then righteousness, which obviously go hand in hand. We made the point that truth was Yeshua, that Yeshua, John 14, Yochanan 14:6, Yeshua says that he is truth. Psalm 119, verse 142, and in verse 160 says that the entirety of the word or the Torah is truth. And then in John 1:14, we find out that Yeshua is the word made flesh. So we have this nice circle here which shows that Yeshua is the walking, talking, living Torah. He is truth. The Torah is truth. And if we're going to gird our waist with truth, we're girding our waist with Torah, and we're girding it with Yeshua. Now, the breastplate of righteousness we discussed in quite a bit of detail, and I believe the point was made about as well and in detail as it could be by the Almighty throughout the Scriptures, that righteousness is something that you do. Okay, righteousness is something you do. We do works of righteousness. We become righteous and are declared righteous because of the actions we take. And we read many verses that talks about people doing or not doing righteousness. So righteousness is an action-based fruit. The actions you take will bear the fruit of righteousness or unrighteousness. And what determines that is whether those actions are those that are in line with the instructions and teachings of the Almighty. We call that the Torah. And so that was the first two elements, and that covered quite a bit of time. So now I want to start continuing now in verse 15, and we'll continue from here. In verse 15 of Ephesians chapter 6, it says, "And having fitted your feet with the preparation of the good news of peace, above all, having taken up the shield of belief with which which you shall have power to quench all the burning arrows of the wicked one, take also the helmet of deliverance and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of Elohim, praying at all times with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, watching in all perseverance and supplication for all the set-apart ones." So this is what we're going to cover today as we're going to get the rest of the details about the armor. So let's begin with verse 15, the idea of fitting your feet with the preparation of the good news of peace. Fitting your feet. When we see the word feet or walk, any of those things, it has to do with what we do. Our feet have to do with walking. What direction are we walking in? What is the walk of our life? How are we walking? And I want us to go to Deuteronomy 10:12. You can hold your place here in Ephesians, and we're going to start looking at how we are supposed to walk, because we're supposed to fit our feet, which is our walk, with the preparation of the good news of peace. So let's look at our walk for a second. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because I'm doing right now a study that will be a separate teaching just on walking in all his ways. But I do want to touch on it quite a bit just to give you the flavor of what's being discussed here. Deuteronomy, Devarim chapter 10 and in verse 12. Devarim chapter 10 and in verse 12. It says, "And now, Yisrael, what is Yahweh your Elohim asking of you?" Great question. I'm sure once you realize that you were Israel, that all of Yahweh's people are called Israel, that you probably were wondering, well, then what does Yahweh want of you? What is his desire? What is he looking for from you? And this is what he's looking for. What he's looking for is for us to fear Yahweh, to walk in all his ways, to love him and to serve Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your being, to guard the commands of Yahweh and his laws, which I command you today, which are for your good. And that's a very key point as we go through all this, is always to remember that all of his instructions and his teachings are there because they are there to bless us. They are there for our good. Obedience brings blessing. Disobedience brings cursing. And I know many of the teachers have been making this point, so I'm going to make it as well, that Torah observance is what brings blessing. It's what brings the word or declared upon you that you are righteous. It is not what brings salvation. Salvation comes through faith, through Yeshua's sacrifice, and it is something that came completely by grace and not of anything that you did to earn it or deserve it. So let's understand that. But what it does have complete effect on, Torah observance is completely, 100% what determines blessings and the status of righteousness. Okay, cursings and the status of unrighteousness. Okay, and there's probably hundreds and hundreds of verses that I could turn to prove that. We did so quite a bit last week. But notice what he says here in verse 12. The second thing that he wants us to do, the first thing is to fear him, and we have a teaching on the website about that. So you're welcome to go listen to that. Fearing him is the first most important step, because if we don't fear him, we're not going to do the rest of the steps. But the second step is to walk in all his ways. So he's looking for us to walk in his ways. And so that's the idea of fitting our feet. We have to fit our feet, prepare our feet. And how do we fit and prepare something? Well, we have to figure out what his ways are. We have to study. We have to pray. We have to look and seek his ways. What is it that he wants? What would he have us do? How would he have us walk? See, that takes preparation. That's something that you have to make an effort to go ahead and get ready for. If you're just going to walk in a random way, your random way will not likely be in his way. Going down his path requires a conscious decision and effort to choose to go down that path. You have to have an awareness of what his path is so that you can be on it. Now, if I was in New York and I wanted to drive to California, and I didn't know where east, west, and north and south were, I couldn't understand looking at the sun and the shadows to know which direction is which. If I just randomly got in my car and started driving, there's a random chance I may end up eventually in California. There's also a real good chance I'll end up somewhere that's not California. because there's a lot of random directions I could go. And every time I come to a fork in the road, there's another random chance that I will choose a wrong direction that will not take me to my goal, which would be California. Well, the same thing is with us. Our goal is the kingdom. Our goal is to spend forever with the Almighty. And if we are going to just walk randomly, we are not likely to get there. We have to walk consciously and purposely in the direction that he tells us to walk, because that path that he sets in front of us, that's the path that leads to the kingdom. That's the path that leads to forever with the Almighty. And so it's very important that after we've girded our waist with truth, we've got the breastplate of righteousness, that we understand that we have to have our feet fitted to walk it out. We have to walk this out with the preparation of the good news of peace, because then we have to be able to share that with other people. Because we are doing this, we're preparing so that we can share that good news with others, that his path leads to peace. His walk leads to shalom. His walk leads to the blessings. This is the good news. The good news is that walking his ways brings on all the blessings and brings you the forever with him, brings you the ability to actually enjoy the salvation that he's offering. He's offering it freely. Whether you get to have it or not is completely in your hands. You can choose not to have it. And so the good news is that salvation is being offered, and that righteousness is something that can be declared upon you if you know the way to walk. And we can declare that good news to people so they can know there is a way that's right. There is a way that brings blessing. There is a way that leads to the joy and the peace and all of the things that we all want. And he gives us that in the scriptures, in his word. And so here we're told that he wants us to walk in all his ways. This is what he's asking of all of us who are Israel. He wants us to fear him and to walk in all his ways. Let's look at Deuteronomy 11, the next chapter over, and look at verse 22. He says, "If you diligently guard all these commands which I command you to do them, to love Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in all his ways, and to cling to him, then Yahweh shall drive out all these nations before you, and you shall dispossess greater and stronger nations than you." So again, if we're looking at the idea of the good news of peace, he's saying, look, those that would not have peace with you, those that would be your enemies, I will drive them out. This is good news, to know that he will drive out our enemies, that he will set the path straight, that he will protect us and clear the way for us. But it's notice that there's an if there. He says, if you diligently guard all these commands which I command you, and there's another part of it, to do them. So you're not just guarding them, you're guarding to do them, to love Yahweh your Elohim and to walk in all his ways. The problem is that we want to walk in all our ways, and then we want to claim that they're his ways. And this is a very, very slippery slope that I assure you leads to disaster. So continuing here, he says in verse 24, he says, "Every place on which the sole of your foot treads is yours, from the wilderness of and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, even to the western sea is your border. No man shall stand against you. Yahweh your Elohim shall put the dread of you and the fear of you upon all the land where you tread, as he has spoken to you. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing when you obey the commands of Yahweh your Elohim, which I command you today, and the curse if you do not obey the commands of Yahweh your Elohim, but turn aside from the way which I command you today to go after other mighty ones which you have not known." See, this is exactly what I've been saying. Blessing and cursing is 100% directly linked to whether or not you are obeying his words and walking in his ways. When you guard to keep, when you guard to do, and you make the effort by preparing yourself, and how do you prepare yourself? Well, you first have to go out there and figure out what it is that he wants you to do. And how do you do that? Well, you read what he said in his word. And here's the hard part. You believe him. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next part of this. But see, that's the thing, is that we have to get to the place where he said it, you believe it, and so then you move forward and actually act accordingly because he said it and you believe it. And so my question is, do you believe what he says here? He says, very clearly, he says, look, I'm setting before you blessing and cursing, blessing when you obey, cursing when you do not obey. I mean, either we believe that or we don't. Deuteronomy 26 and verse 16. Devarim 26. Now we're getting into some verses that are part of this week's portion. Devarim 26 and in verse 16. "Today Yahweh your Elohim is commanding you to do these laws and right rulings, and you shall guard and do them with all your heart and with all your being. You have today caused Yahweh to proclaim to be your Elohim and to walk in his ways and guard his laws and his commands and his right rulings and to obey his voice. This is the contract that people are signing. This is the contract that all of us are signing on to. Yahweh is commanding us to do these laws. Yahweh is we're proclaiming that Yahweh is our Elohim. We're proclaiming that we're going to walk in his ways and guard his laws. We're proclaiming that we're going to be submissive to his commands and his right rulings, and that we will obey his voice. Verse 18, and Yahweh has caused you to proclaim today to be his people, a treasured possession, as he has spoken to you, and to guard his commands, so as to set you high above all nations which he has made for a praise and for a name and for an esteem, for you to be a set-apart people to Yahweh your Elohim as he has spoken. This is the good news of peace. This is the good news of shalom, to let people know that if you choose to change your citizenship from the world to Israel, the Israel of Scripture, and that you become a citizen of the body of the believers known as the Israelites, those who are submissive to the Almighty, whose king is coming, named Yeshua, that kingdom has going into it 12 gates. The 12 gates are the 12 names of the 12 tribes. Okay, we need to understand there's no such thing as a Gentile believer. You cannot be. It's an oxymoron. Okay, if you are a believer, then you are an Israelite. You are no longer a Gentile. You have changed your citizenship. Gentile, by definition, means of the nations who are outside of the nation of Israel. All other nations. And so, for those of you who are walking around telling everybody that you're a Gentile believer, please stop doing that, because if you're a believer, you're no longer Gentile. There is no Gentile gate. There is no place for the Gentiles in the kingdom. There's a place for them if they change citizenship to become Israelite. And that's what Scripture is all about. Everybody is welcome. Everybody can be a part of this whole thing that the Father is doing by making a choice to change their citizenship. It does not make a difference what you were before. This is why I say in a lot of the teachings why we have the whole story of Ruth in here. Ruth was a Moabitess. Deuteronomy tells us that no Moabite or Ammonite can be in the assembly onto the 10th generation. We then see that Ruth, with Boaz, is in the lineage of Messiah. How can that be? Because once she decided to change her citizenship, she was no longer looked at as a Moabitess. She said, I'm going to change citizenship. She told Naomi, your people will be my people, your ways, my ways, your Elohim, my Elohim. She changed citizenship. And so this is what it's all about, the changing of citizenship. Okay? We need to have the citizenship of Israel be what we have. Is there a problem with the sound? Let's just do a quick sound check here before I continue. Okay, so we were in Devarim in Deuteronomy chapter 26, and we were looking at verse 16 and going forward. And it says here again that we have proclaimed that Yahweh is our Elohim. And having said that, we are basically obligating ourselves to a path. Because if he is our Elohim and we are going to be his people, and if we're going to look at verse 18 and be to him a treasured people, a treasured possession, a set-apart nation, then he's expecting certain things from us. And what he's expecting is that as citizens in his nation, as being a part of his people, that we are going to, in verse 17, walk in all his ways and guard his laws and his commands and his right rulings, and most of all, obey his voice. And so we get to hear his voice every time we open up the scriptures and read what he says. That's where we get to hear his voice loud and clearly every single day. We don't have to wait to actually physically hear a voice. We can actually read his words in this book. And so we get to do that. So let's continue now as we go forward in chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy 6 and in verse 4. Devarim 6 and in verse 4. Hear, O Yisrael, Shema Yisrael, Yahweh our Elohim, Yahweh is one. And you shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your might. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be in your heart, and you shall impress them upon your children, and shall speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way. and when you lie down and when you rise up. They shall be as you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. See, this is an all-encompassing thing. This sounds like the armor here is being worn by the person being described here. This is a person that has themselves completely immersed in the elements here. They're girding their waist with truth. They've got the breastplate of righteousness, and they're now fitted their feet with the preparation of the good news, and they're talking about this stuff when they walk by the way. Sounds like their feet are fitted with that preparation. They're speaking it to their children. They're speaking it in their house. They're speaking it when they rise up and when they lay down. That is what is being talked about here in a very strong sense, is that this is what is expected of his people. His people are all about him, not about us. It's all about him. And his people are talking about him day and night, all day long, and we're focused on what he wants and what his ways are and being submissive to his voice and obeying his instructions. And that's what it's all about. Because why? Because we love him with all of our heart and with all of our might and with all of our being. And that's how the love is expressed. It's expressed through our obedience, our submissiveness, and the appreciation that his instructions are there to bless. That obedience brings the blessing. And so we are so filled with the blessing that we cannot help ourselves in just praising and joyfully worshiping the one that we love so much, because he cared enough to keep us from the trouble by putting us on a path that protects us from the disasters and the things that will easily beset us and put us in trouble. I said this on other teachings. I'll say it again now. As a parent, I tell my children all the time, one of my jobs is to keep you safe. Well, the Almighty's job is to keep us safe. And part of that job of keeping us safe is that he gives us instruction that tells you, if you do these things, it keeps you safe. That's the good news of peace, the good news of shalom. It brings peace. Yeshua, the one who brings the peace beyond all other understanding. And so if we are going to fit our feet with the preparation, that the whole point here is the emphasis on the word preparation, we must be seeking and studying and fasting and praying to understand what it is that he would have us to do. What is that path that we are to be on so that we can walk in all his ways? Let's go to chapter 8 and verse 1. Stay in Devarim, chapter 8 and verse 1. Guard to do every command which I command you today, that you might live and shall increase and go in, and shall possess the land of which Yahweh swore to your fathers. Have you noticed that almost every verse here starts out with guard to do every command which I command you today? Keep and do every command I command you today. Every. Guard, watch over, be sure, remember, be careful. Don't forget. He says, verse 2, and you shall remember that Yahweh your Elohim led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble us. That's the key, because we're walking through our own personal wilderness, and the first step is we have to be humbled. To humble you, to prove you, to know what is in your heart, whether you will guard his commands or not. That's the first part of it. Now, listen, and he humbled you and let you suffer hunger, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, to make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes forth from the mouth of Yahweh. Your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell for these 40 years. Thus you shall know in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so Yahweh disciplines you. Yahweh your Elohim will discipline you. Therefore you shall guard, listen now, the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim to walk in his ways and to fear him. Why? Because Yahweh your Elohim is bringing you into a good land, verse 7, a land of streams of water, fountains of springs that flow out of the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land in which you eat bread without scarcity, in which you do not lack at all, a land whose stones are iron and out of whose hills you dig copper. And you shall eat and be satisfied and shall bless Yahweh Elohim for the good land which he has given you. That's what it's all about. He's looking to bless us, and walking in all his ways will lead to that blessing. And that's why it's such an important part of the armor, is to make sure that your feet are well fitted with the preparation of the good news. With the preparation of the good news, which we are reading about here. Let's go to Deuteronomy 28. A couple of more verses here in Devarim in Deuteronomy 28. And in verse 1, Devarim 28 and in verse 1, And it shall be, if you diligently obey the voice of Yahweh your Elohim, to guard, to do all his commands, which I command you today, that Yahweh your Elohim shall set you high above all the nations of the earth. If you diligently obey the voice, to guard the commands, Yahweh will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And all, listen to this, all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of Yahweh your Elohim. Blessed are you in the city, and blessed are you in the field, blessed in the fruit of your body, and fruit of your ground, and the fruit of your livestock, the increase of your cattle, and the offspring of your flocks. Blessed is your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed are you when you come in, and blessed are you when you go out. Yahweh causes your enemies who rise against you to be smitten before your face. They come against you one way and flee before you 7 ways. Yahweh commands the blessing on you in your storehouses and in all to which you set your hand, and shall bless you in the land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you. Yahweh does establish you as a set-apart people to himself, as he has sworn to you, if you guard the commands. Now listen, if you guard the commands of Yahweh your Elohim and walk in all his ways. That's the key. That's the key. And all the peoples of the earth, verse 10, shall see that the name of Yahweh is called upon you, and they shall be afraid of you. Now, let's not go any further from there. If all the nations of the earth are going to understand and see that you're walking around with his name on you, the only way that's going to happen is if you're doing what it said just previous to that, which is guarding his commands and walking in all his ways. Guarding in his commands and walking in all his ways. How many times have I seen on some mainstream Christian show people being told, to walk, uprightly as good Christians because, they're bearing the name of Messiah on them and ... whatever, etc., etc. Can we understand the deception that's in that? You cannot be walking in a way that shows and proves that the Almighty's name is on you if you're not walking in Torah observance, if you're not walking in these commandments. That's what it says right here. It says, and I'll read it again, Yahweh, verse 9, does establish you as a set-apart people to himself, as he has sworn to you, if you guard the commands of Yahweh your Elohim and walk in his ways. That is the only way that it works. It doesn't happen because of any other process. There's no altar call. There's no claiming a name. There's nothing else involved here, he says, except if you guard his commands and you walk in his ways. And all the peoples of the earth shall see that the name of Yahweh is called upon you. Now we have the good news. Remember, this was written before Yeshua showed up and died and was resurrected. And so we have more to the picture that we can now add. We can now add and share that the walking, living, talking Torah has been here on the earth and went through a process that made salvation possible. And we have that good news to share to those who don't know. But it's adding more detail, it's adding more depth, it's adding more to the understanding to what's already here, which is the commandment keeping. It's not saying that was for them and now we have Yeshua. Well, Yeshua is the walking, talking Torah, so how can you have Yeshua and not have Torah? He says, if you love me, keep my commandments. What commandments was he talking about? Well, he's the commandment giver. It was his voice on Mount Sinai. He's the one who gave us the Torah. If you love me, keep my commandments. The whole scriptures from cover to cover is all about Yahweh saying, if you love me, keep my commandments. Deuteronomy 6 we read, and you shall love Yahweh with all your heart, with all your being, and keep his commandments. Everything in scripture is about, if you love him, you'll keep his commandments. Keep my commandments. Love me. Focus on that, and all things will come in abundance, in blessing upon you. It says you will be overtaken by the blessing. It'll be so incredible, the amount of blessing, that it will literally overtake you. Let's continue in Devarim 29 and in verse 10. Deuteronomy 29 and in verse 10. All of you are standing today before Yahweh your Elohim, your leaders, your tribes, your elders, and your officers, all the men of Israel, your little ones, your wives, and your sojourner who is in the midst of your camp, from the one who cuts your wood to the one who draws your water, so that you should enter into covenant with Yahweh your Elohim and into his oath, which Yahweh your Elohim makes with you today, in order to establish you today as a people for himself, and he himself to be your Elohim, as he has spoken to you, as he has sworn to your fathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now listen to verse 14, it's very key. And not with you alone am I making this covenant and this oath, but with him who stands here with us today before Yahweh your Elohim, as well as with him who is not here with us today. Well, who could he be talking about there? Who are the people not there with him today? The people that were going to read this. Let's continue. He says, for you know how we dwelt in the land of Mitzrayim, and how we passed through the nations which you passed through, and you saw their abominations and their idols, wood and stone, silver and gold, which was with them, lest there should be among you a man or woman or a clan or tribe whose heart turns away today from Yahweh your Elohim, to go and serve the mighty ones of these nations, lest there should be among you a root of bearing bitterness or wormwood. And it shall be when he hears the words of this curse that he should bless himself in his heart, saying, I have peace, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart, in order to add drunkenness to thirst. You notice how that was worded right there? The word peace and walking. When we're talking about fitting our feet with the preparedness of the good news of peace. See, there's a lie that we tell ourselves. We says here, we bless ourselves in our own heart, saying, I have peace, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart. In other words, I can do whatever I want, and I have peace. I'm fine. No problems over here. And basically saying that that's adding drunkenness to thirst. Here you're thirsty, and you're thirsting for the pure water from the Almighty, and yet you're drinking that which is just going to make you, in a drunken stupor, and make you act like a fool, saying silly things like, I have peace, though I walk any way I want. It says, Yahweh would not forgive him, but rather the displeasure of Yahweh and his jealousy shall burn against that man, and every curse that is written in this book shall settle on him, and Yahweh shall blot out his name from under the heavens. That's pretty strong stuff right there. That's pretty strong stuff right there. But are we getting all of this here? He's saying, look, this is a covenant he's making with his people and all future people that are willing to come into covenant with him, understanding that the covenant has to do with obeying, walking in his ways, guarding his commands, and submitting to his teachings and instructions, so that we are in absolute submission to his authority, looking to him for our bread, to live on every word that comes forth from his mouth, and that we are completely broken of our self-sovereignty. Because it's not within man to know even where to place his own feet. We have that verse in the scriptures. And we don't. We don't know. So we have to prepare our path. We have to prepare our feet to be able to walk this out. Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 15. See, I told you we would cover a lot of verses out of this week's Torah portion. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 15, he says, See, I have set before you today life and good and death and evil, and that I am commanding you today to love Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in his ways, to guard his commands and his laws and his right rulings. Here we go. Here it is. One more time. Walk in all his ways, guard his commands, his laws, and his right rulings. And this is why. And you shall live and increase, and Yahweh your Elohim shall bless you in the land which you go to possess. See? All of that stuff, walking in his ways, guarding his commands, and his laws, and his right rulings, lead to the blessing. Verse 17, But if your heart turns away, and you do not obey, and you shall be drawn away, and shall bow down to other mighty ones, and serve them, I have declared to you today that you shall certainly perish, and you shall not prolong your days in the land which you are passing over the Jordan to possess. I have called the heavens and earth as witnesses today against you. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore you shall choose life, so that you live, both you and your seed, to love Yahweh your Elohim and obey his voice, to cling to him, for he is your life and the length of your days, to dwell in the land in which Yahweh swore to your fathers, Abraham, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov, to give them. Now, interestingly, he says, I have called the heavens and the earth as witnesses today against you. He's called the heavens and the earth as witnesses against them. Now, let me just turn quickly. I want to make sure I give you the right verse. But give me 1 second. In Matthew 5, we are told, do not think, Matthew 5:17, Yeshua says, do not think that I came to destroy the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to complete. For truly I say to you, till the heaven and the earth pass away, One jot or tittle shall by no means pass from the Torah until all be done. There is your complete connection to that. He's referring to what he said, what's here in Deuteronomy 30. The heaven and earth are witnesses to the covenant. In other words, every time we look up and see, well, let's see, the stars, the sun, the moon, the heavens, the earth, they're all still here. They're still witnessing that this covenant and the requirements of this covenant are still valid and still stand. So it's very, very important that we're grasping this. And it's amazing how many people can read these sections over and over and over and not hear over and over and over that the blessing comes from the submission and the obedience and the walking in all of his ways. Yet we have all of mainstream Christianity's focus on that the law was done away with. You don't have to do all that stuff. That was for them. We're the new spiritual Israel. We're the replacement, and we don't have to do any of these things. And then they wonder why they're not blessed. The blessing comes from the obedience, the submission, the walking in all his ways. Otherwise, he's a liar. And the Almighty is not a liar. Look at Psalm 119 in verse 1, and then we'll move on to the next piece. Psalm Tehillim 119 and in verse 1. Tehillim 119 and in verse 1. Blessed are the perfect in the way who walk in the teaching of Yahweh. Blessed are the perfect in the way who walk in the Torah of Yahweh, the teachings of Yahweh. You want to be blessed? It says it right here. Blessed are those who walk in the teachings of Yahweh. Blessed are those who observe his witness, verse 2, who seek him with all their heart. Yea, they shall do no unrighteousness. They shall walk in his ways. Well, of course, if you're walking in his ways, you can't do unrighteousness because all of his ways are the righteous ways. That's by the definition of what righteousness is. We talked about that last week. So if you want to be blessed, then you have to fit your feet with the preparation of the good news, which means you have to go and find out how you should be walking so that you can actually do the walking in all of his ways, because that's what it's all about. Let's go back now to Ephesians chapter 6 and look at the next piece. Ephesians chapter 6 and in verse 16 it says, above all, or it should be in all, in other words, in all of all this, make sure that we're taking up the shield of belief, with which you shall have power to quench all the burning arrows of the wicked one. See, because if you don't have belief, then none of this, the rest of this is going to work. I mean, if you don't trust him, and if you don't believe what he said, none of this is going to matter. Yeshua said over and over again, your belief has made you well. Your belief has set you free. Your belief has healed you. Your belief... And what happened when he went to his own town? Nobody was healed. Why? Because they didn't believe who he was. If you don't believe, if you don't trust, it's never going to work. It's never going to work. That's at the very, very base and heart. So it says here that if you have the belief, the shield of belief, that then you will be able to quench all the burning arrows of the wicked one. Because what is the wicked one going to do? What has he always done? What's the first thing we see happening in Genesis chapters, in the very beginning in Genesis chapter 3? Chapters 2 and chapter 2 or chapter 3. What does the enemy say? He says, did Yahweh really say? Is this really what his instruction was? In chapter 3 of Genesis, Bereshit. I mean, that's the thing, is if you don't know what he said, if you don't have the belief, the trust in knowing that what he said is what he said and that he meant what he said, because really the enemy's saying, did he really mean what he said? Like, did he really mean not to eat of all the trees? Did he really mean that? Did he really mean that you had to keep Shabbat? Did he really mean that you couldn't eat whatever it is that you want to eat that's not kosher? That's not according to Leviticus chapter 11? Did he really mean that? Do you really have to do all this stuff? See, if you have on the shield of belief, you'll be able to quench all those arrows. You'll be able to quench all those arrows. What did Yeshua do in his battle in the desert with the enemy? The enemy said one thing, and he responded with what? Torah instruction from the Almighty saying, no, this is what the Almighty said about all that. And so the enemy was doing that same exact thing he does with all of us. He says, come on, go do this and do that and bow down to me and I'll give you all this stuff. And he said, no, you shall not do this. You shall not tempt Yahweh your Elohim. You shall not, offer things that you can't offer. You see? He quoted scripture right back at him. Isn't that a perfect example of what we should be able to do? If we believe, then we're going to study. If we study, then we're going to have the tools at our hands so that we can go ahead and fight fire with fire, so to speak, because we have the true fire, the fire of the word, and we have the shield of faith, the shield of belief that will quench the fiery arrows of the enemy. Let's continue. I'm not going to go too far into belief here because there's a whole nother teaching that I have that you can have access to called Do You Believe? That's also on the website. So rather than spend too much time on that part of it right here, I would just encourage you to listen to that where I go very heavily into the whole idea of belief. Next part, take also the helmet of deliverance and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of Elohim. So the next thing is the helmet of deliverance. The word helmet here comes from the Greek perikephalia, which I'm probably butchering the way it's pronounced, which has the idea of encircling your head. In other words, wrap your head with this. Encircle your head with this. With what? The deliverance. Encircle your head with deliverance. What is it that delivers you? And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Wrap your mind in the truth. What is the truth? The Torah, Yeshua. We went through all of that last week. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Deliverance here has the idea of the defender. Okay, something which means defense or defender. So in other words, wrap your mind and your head with the defender. Luke chapter 3 and verse 4. There are only a few verses that use that same Greek word. I'm going to read a couple of them to you here. Luke chapter 3 and in verse 4. Luke 3 and in verse 4. Well, we'll start in verse 3. And he went into all the neighborhood of the Jordan, proclaiming an immersion of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, as it has been written in the book of the words of Yeshua the prophet, saying, a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahweh, make his path straight. Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall become straight, and the rough become smooth ways, and all the flesh shall see the deliverance of Elohim. See, all flesh will see the deliverance. How will they see the deliverance? Those who choose to embrace the truth will personally experience the deliverance, and those who are not either yet ready or those who refuse will see the effect of your acceptance of the deliverance. So all flesh will see it. They'll get to see it. Now, whether they get to experience it is based on their choices, but they're going to see it. Yeshayahu chapter, well, stay here in Luke, but let's turn quickly to Yeshayahu and come back to Luke. Yeshayahu 40, Isaiah 40, and in verse 3. Yeshayahu 40, and in verse 3. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahweh, make straight in the desert a highway for your Elohim. Let every valley be raised and every mountain. This is what Yochanan was quoting. And the steep ground shall become level, and the rough places smooth. And the esteem of Yahweh shall be revealed, and all flesh together shall see it. For the mouth of Yahweh has spoken it. For the mouth of Yahweh has spoken it. So here we have it again. This is where it's quoted from. It says, all flesh together shall see it. Now, what this also can be referring to, that the esteem of Yahweh shall be revealed and all flesh together shall see it, can be referring to Yeshua walking on the earth, that the flesh then got to see it, but also we know that when he returns, all flesh will see his return at the same time. Everyone will see his coming. There's so many layers to all of this. Every one of these pieces could be a separate teaching, but we need to keep moving. Luke chapter 2 and in verse 25. Luke chapter 2 and verse 25. And see, there was a man in Yerushalayim whose name was Shimon, and this man was righteous and dedicated, looking for the comforting of Israel, and the set-apart spirit was upon him. Now, why was he looking for the comforting of Israel? Because he knew the prophecies. that talked about the comforting of Yisrael. And it had been revealed to him, verse 26, by the set-apart Spirit, that he would not see death before he sees the Messiah of Yahweh. And he came in the Spirit into the set-apart place, and as his parents brought in the child Yeshua, to do for him according to the usual practice of the Torah, then he took him up in his arms and blessed Elohim and said, Now let your servant go in peace, O Master, according to your word, for mine eyes have seen your deliverance, which you have prepared before the face of all the peoples. See, Yeshua is the deliverance. The Torah, the walking, living Torah, is the deliverance. And we need to wrap our head with this. We have to wrap our mind around this. You know, it says sometimes I can't wrap my head around that, or I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that. We got to wrap our head with this stuff so that we can protect our mind and our thoughts, which we talked about several weeks ago. Acts chapter 28 and verse 28. We need to really spend time getting to the place where we can really wrap ourselves, be wrapped up in this stuff and have it wrapped around our head. Acts 28 and in verse 28. Therefore let it be known to you that the deliverance of Elohim has been sent to the Gentiles, and they shall hear. See, the deliverance was sent to the Gentiles because the deliverance is for all flesh. And if they choose to be delivered, then they will make a citizenship choice and no longer be Gentile. And that's key. Keep that always in the back of your mind to understand. That if they make that choice and accept the deliverance, that they are delivered out of the ignorance of being in the nations to becoming wise and with understanding and being in the nation known as Israel. So let's continue back in Ephesians with taking up in the next verse, in verse 17, take also the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of Elohim. Okay, now, the word that is translated as word here comes from the Greek Reme, which means an utterance. It's talking about something that is spoken. Okay? And so throughout Scripture, we're told that Yahweh spoke it and it came into existence. We're told over and over again about the spoken word, and then the word, that spoken word was made flesh in John chapter 1 and verse 14. So now what we are doing is we're going to take up the sword of the Spirit, which is the word. So the sword of the Spirit is the word of Elohim. So let's start in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 12. Ivrim 4 and in verse 12. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 12. For the word of Elohim is living and working and sharper than any two-edged sword, cutting through even to the dividing of being and spirit and of joints and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and the intentions of the heart. This is what we're dealing with. This is the word of Elohim. It is living and working and sharper than any two-edged sword. It's going to cut through all the nonsense to the heart of the matter and to the truth. It's going to cut right down to the nitty-gritty. This is part of the humbling process we read about in Deuteronomy chapter 8, where he says he will humble you to prove you, to test you, to know. That word is going to cut through you, and it's a double-edged sword. It's sharper than anything. It's sharper than any sword. And so when you're armed with it, it can cut through all of that stuff that the enemy may want to throw at you. Yeshayahu 49 in verse 2 says, and he made my mouth like a sharp sword. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. This is a prophetic verse referring to Mashiach, that his mouth would be like a sharp sword. In Revelation 1 in verse 16 it says, and in his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp two-edged sword. See the consistent flow from Yeshayahu 49:2 into Revelation 1:16, the fulfillment. And in Revelation 2:12 and in verse 16 of Revelation 2 it says, and he who has the sharp two-edged sword says this. And in verse 16 it says, repent, or else I shall come to you speedily and fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Revelation 19 and in verse 15. I know I'm just quoting these real quickly, but I just want to get this kind of, in there. Revelation 19 and verse 15, he says, and out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations. Well, if his mouth has a sharp sword, and the sword is a word, the spoken word is the Torah, and the Torah, when he throws it out there, if it's not obeyed, is going to bring a lot of smiting, isn't it? And the Torah says those who do not obey and do not submit and do not walk in all his ways will get smitten. They will pay the penalty and the punishment of receiving all the curses. In verse 21 of Revelation 19, it says, and the rest were killed with the sword which came from the mouth of him who sat on the horse. So that's kind of where that analogy really kind of pulls together. So we are to take up this sword, the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of Elohim. You've got to be studying the word so that you can wield it properly as a sword. Now let me quickly and strongly make a point so that I'm not given to being misunderstood here. It is not a sword to be wielded to beat up your brother. This is not a sword to be wielded to beat up your brother. We are not supposed to be, Torah terrorists bashing our brother over their head with the sword of the word. That's what we're supposed to be talking to them with meekness and gentleness and kindness and patience. This is for fighting against the principalities and the spirit world. This is for your spiritual battle. This is to help you in the battle over your salvation. The battle and the temptations that are going to come that may tempt you to give up your crown. This is not to be wielded against each other. That is not what it's talking about here. Let's make sure that's really clear. The word is to be wielded against, as Ephesians says, I'm going to turn there just so I can read it correctly for you. Let's just read what we're dealing with and what we're fighting against. We're fighting against not flesh and blood, that would be your brother, but we're wrestling against principalities, authorities, world rulers of darkness of this age, and spiritual matters and wickedness in the heavenlies. That's what this sword is for. It is not for your wrestling against flesh and blood. Flesh and blood requires patience, kindness, meekness, gentleness, long-suffering, loving your enemy, praying for those who wrongfully abuse you, etc., etc. These weapons, this armor, is for the spiritual battle. For the spiritual battle. Let's be clear on that. So let's wrap this all up. Let's read Romans 13 and verse 12, and then we'll go back to Ephesians, and we'll conclude. So hold your place here in Ephesians, and we'll wrap this all up. There's a huge spiritual battle going on, and you have to be well equipped and well armed and well armored in order to survive. And that is what Paul is talking about here. Romans 13 and in verse 12. The night is far advanced, the day has come near. Can we all agree that that is true? And even more so now than when Paul said this? Can we all agree? The day has certainly come much nearer now than it was then. So let us put off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. Now, I don't have time to go into the whole aspect of light here, but that's what he was talking about in Ephesians 6. This is the armor of light to fight against the forces of dark, the first forces of darkness. He said, let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk becomingly as in the day, not in wild parties and drunkenness, not in living together in indecencies, not in fighting and envy, but put on the Master Yeshua Messiah and make no provision for the lust of the flesh. Now notice what he says here. He says, put on the Master Yeshua. The Master Yeshua Messiah is every piece and part of that armor. He is the truth that we're girding our waist with. He's the truth that we're girding our waist with. He is the Torah, which is what the walking, living Torah, which is the righteousness that our breastplate is made out of, the breastplate of righteousness. He is what we're fitting and preparing our feet with as we're going to bring forth the good news. He is what we're wrapping around our head with the helmet of deliverance. He is the shield of belief. And he is the word, the sword, that cuts deeper than any two-edged sword. So Rav Shaul is making it very clear here as he tells us, look, the night is far advanced, the day has come near. There's no more time to be wasting. Enough nonsense and goofing off. Let's take this seriously. He says, let us put off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. And verse 14 again, he says, but put on Master Yeshua Messiah and make no provision for the lusts of the flesh. The lust of the flesh includes any time you choose your self-sovereignty over what Yahweh said to do. Sometimes when people hear the word lust, they think only of like wild sexual parties or gluttony or something. Anytime your desire comes before his desire, that is a lust of the flesh. I think that's about as simple as I can put it. When your physical, fleshly, self-sovereign mind desires something that goes against what Yahweh says he desires, that is a fleshly desire. That's a lust of the flesh. And that is your biggest problem, because the enemy knows that you lust after these things in your flesh, and so he does everything he can to kind of push those buttons and put those things in front of your eyes, which are the gateways to your lusts, and he puts it there to tempt you, because that's where he gets to stir up that self-sovereignty stuff. Okay? That's where that self-sovereignty gets really stirred up. Let's go back to Ephesians chapter 6, and we'll wrap this up. Ephesians chapter 6. And we'll read in verse 11. Okay, it says, put on the complete armor. We just read that. For you to have the power to stand against the schemes of the devil. That's the point here. We're putting on the complete. Now notice the word there is complete. You can't leave any of the pieces out. We need all of it. For you to have power to stand against the schemes of the devil. Because we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and authorities, against the world rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual matters of wickedness in the heavenlies. Now listen, because of this, take up the complete armor of Elohim, so that you have power to withstand in the wicked day. That's now, folks. And having done all, to stand. There's a lot of entire and complete and alls in those couple of verses there. You need all of it. You need the complete armor. You need to do all, having done all, to stand. I think if we understand this depth of what I'm reading here and the depth of what Paul was talking about and the depth of what is said throughout all of the verses we've been looking at, there's just not a lot of time to be goofing off and watching all the television we watch and doing all of the debating and arguing over nonsense that we do. There's just no time for that. All we're doing every time we do that stuff is open up all these nice little doors for the enemy to get in there and keep us away from focusing on what we need to focus on. And that's the key. He can distract us and basically to death, because the distractions will lead to death. Folks, it is getting closer and closer, and it is getting darker and darker, and the days are getting more and more wicked, and we are absolutely in dire need of making sure that our armor is in good condition, that it is ready, that it's covering all of our body, that there are no kinks in it, that there are no gaps in it, that there's no holes in it. And we need to be working on and studying and focusing on making sure that every element of that armor is in good working order and on us at all times. Why? So that when we get into the battle, which is a daily endeavor, we can do all and we can stand. So I hope that the teaching blessed you. I hope that this encourages you and that it gives you the kind of the prodding that may be necessary to work on some of the areas where there may be some holes in your armor, and to make sure to fix that as quickly as possible so that we do not give a hold or a point where the enemy can get in. Because that is your job. The Father does not say, just because I called you and gave you some understanding and opened your eyes and your understanding to truth, that he's going to prevent the attacks of the enemy. Because he needs to test you, to humble you, to prove you, to see where your heart's at. He's going to allow the enemy to have a certain amount of access to you to see what you do. Now, we also know he says that no trial will be allowed to come upon you that is uncommon to men and that you could not handle. Okay? But I really need you to understand that since he's going to allow a certain amount of this stuff to happen to you, that we need to then do what he says. He tells you what to do about it. He says, go ahead and put on the armor. And so the encouragement here is that we all be well equipped and armed. So having said all that, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. I pray, Father, that this message would bear fruit, that anything that I said that was not of you, that anything I said that was not what you would have said, that you would just make that so clear to everyone that they would just ignore that, but that all that was yours and all that was of you, that it would reach the heart and the marrow of the people that hear, so that they would be drawn to your truth and your understanding, and then take the necessary action to walk in your ways, to put on their armor, and to have the protection that you offer against the schemes and the devices of the enemy. So, Father, we just pray, placing all of this in your hands in the name of Yeshua. Amen and amen.